Didn't see you with this slide, but yeah, I take it there's quite a few of people who dared the morning traffic and came here. Thank you very much. We're very excited to be here for another day of engagement and interaction, especially looking at what's ahead for us. I think what happened yesterday, what I've seen yesterday, the panels that were here, the caliber of people that we have been bringing here is amazing. And I really hope that you're going to take a lot of things back as you interact with everybody. So anyway, I would now be very happy to announce our first speaker this morning. Her name is Nina Siedler. She is the board member of INATBA. She's a partner at the DWF. But besides that, she has a great legacy in community building. She has been involved in the European think tank that is now, obviously, with this conference, grown into a global think tank. I would very much like to welcome Ms. Nina Siedler to the stage. Good morning. There you go.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Malaga again, also from my side. I would like to do a bit of a recap how we actually all got here to Malaga. And the story began last November, precisely a year ago, with the European Commission inviting for the first time the blockchain industry to a round table to discuss the initiation of a global blockchain industry association, which finally became INATBA. It took us a couple of months until the official launch in April to get this set up and to bring everybody on board across the industries and sectors, and also the whole range from the representatives of public permissionless systems to the users of private permission DLT technology. And this is, I believe, what really makes the strength of this association, that it is not narrowed down to a specific sector or to a specific belief in the blockchain space, but we are really trying to involve everybody. And the second important point about INATBA is that the European Commission built in by default, so to speak, a communication channel into the public sector and the governmental side by writing into our articles of association that we need to have a governmental advisory board. And we built it over the past month and will continue to build it. And the governmental advisory board includes global organizations like various United Nations organizations, and we're talking to World Bank, OECD, and the like. And at the same time, we're bringing on board national regulators, representatives of ministries, whoever is involved. In some countries, it's the Ministry of Finance, in the other, it's the Ministry of Economics. Some have specific ministries for digital affairs, in the aim to combine them with the working groups we have built over the past months. And I promised to read out to you the working groups that we have so that I don't miss anyone here, and to invite you to get engaged in the various efforts of those teams. So we have a working group for education, which broke down in 2 subgroups already. Energy, which is also a vast area, they built 3 subgroups. Finance, the same. Then we have a smaller but very important working group on governance, which is holding its invite-only roundtable right now at this time. We have healthcare and a large group for identity. We've got a group for interoperability, for mobility, and again a large group for privacy, obviously an important topic. We have a public sector group, a real estate group, a working group on social impact and supply chain. You will see from that list that this is not complete yet, and any members are invited to form new working groups on areas they deem important and where they can convince further members to join their efforts. Alongside of the governmental advisory board, INATBA also has an academic advisory board, where we try to bring together, the brightest minds across the globe out of the academic space, and also to connect them with our working groups. Then the last thing that we just announced is the forming of a standardization committee, which will try to bring together the various standardization bodies working on standards in this field to move against the splintering of the standard setting across the globe and to bring them all to one table. So this is my invitation to you to come by. If you're not a member of INATBA yet, please visit us at our booth in the exhibition hall. You will get further information there. We will all welcome you with open arms and integrate you into our network, which is not only restricted to the private industry, but reaches out to the governmental representatives all across the globe. Please help us making our vision a reality and come and join us. And let's work together. And maybe a hint, because I know it's difficult on a large conference like this to find the people of interest for you. If you take a look at the agenda, you will find various invite-only roundtables of our working groups announced there. And you can find and connect with the co-chairs of our working groups. If you're going to that space following their roundtables, you will find them there and can get in touch. Please make use of this opportunity here in Malaga, and I wish everybody a great last day of this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nina. So again, the premise of this whole Congress is for all of us to engage together and to interact. And thank you, Nina, for really reiterating that fact. I really appreciate that. So now I would love to invite my next speaker to the stage, Ms. Maria Valenza. She is the Director of Financial Institution at the DG Competition. Maria, welcome very much to the stage.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As a representative of the Competition Department of the European Commission, I'm very delighted to contribute to this event because precisely it's competition that drives innovation, and digital disruption forms part of that. And innovation accompanied by competition creates room for all kinds of innovators, large or small. I will approach today platforms and data as a means for enhancing market power, and I will try to explain in simple terms the role of competition enforcement. I will concentrate on financial services, which is my area of responsibility, but also because platforms and data play a very prominent role. But first, a few words on digital platforms in general, because digital economy, which we discuss here today, is necessarily a platform economy. Digitization gives us access to billions of possible connections, and that gives platforms enormous power. And the challenge is even greater when you realize that often those platforms face very little competition. In digital markets, it is often the case that being big can give a company such a huge head start that it can be hard for smaller rivals to compete. And once a platform reaches a critical mass, the market can quickly tip in favor of that business, leaving no room for anybody else. Now, coming to financial services. New technologies, as you're well aware, create opportunities for established operators, such as banks, but also new operators to develop solutions which provide better access to finance and improve financial inclusion for digitally connected citizens. but it is businesses in particular that have a great opportunity to benefit from the digital disruption. For example, let's take the banking sector. Digitization and new technologies there mean driving investment, using new technologies to cut costs or provide new services and better tailored products, modernizing structures, reaching new consumers established in other geographies, attracting them towards more profitable segments, and all this is particularly important in a post-financial crisis scenario. We should not forget that. The changes in the way the financial industry is operating are highlighted by the increases for the valuations of fintech companies and the investments in fintechs during the last year. Meanwhile, data is becoming more important for companies to compete. They help them to cut costs and serve their customers better, and training artificial intelligence to take faster and better decisions than humans. New technological solutions emerge, like e-payments, online and mobile payments. Fintech and large technology firms, the big techs such as Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, are expanding digital transformation of the sector. And we also have completely new areas which are emerging, like InsurTech, which uses experiences, knowledge, and data fed in real time from Internet of Things. So while fintechs rely mostly on the traditional infrastructures like access to bank accounts, big techs do not need such access, but establish new infrastructures, such as platforms we are discussing here, where they may be controlling the access themselves. In financial services, just like in other platform-based sectors, one main concern is that platform businesses do not only run a platform, but also compete with other companies that rely on that same platform. Therefore, such platforms may act as both player and referee. We have to be vigilant that platforms do not adjust the way they work and use the power to favor their own services ahead of others. The example of payment services in Europe, which is very much platform-driven. The introduction of new payment methods, platform solutions, and interfaces facilitates provision of inexpensive and near-instant domestic payments. So this is a segment which works. We have the example of the SEPA instant credit transfer scheme, which dramatically accelerates SEPA credit transfer and integrates clearing and settlement. However, challenges in current payment services remain. As regards new payment solution, still progress is to be made on intra and cross-currency payments in Europe. International cross-border payments remain slow, expensive, and opaque, especially for certain retail payments, such as money remittance. Moreover, there are 1.7 billion people globally who are unbanked. So, as we were discussing yesterday, digital payments may be a solution. I say may, but this is an area, a sector, which is still in the making with an infinite number of variants. So yesterday, you followed the discussion on cryptocurrencies. We have thousands of cryptocurrencies, not only Bitcoin and Ethereum. Stable coins such as Facebook's Libra, which is a permissioned blockchain network, are just one of many initiatives that seek to address the existing challenges. You have private money emerging, you have digital local currencies. Yesterday also the Bank of Japan gave a very interesting presentation on central bank digital currencies, and so on and so forth. So all these solutions could potentially contribute to the development of global payment arrangements that are faster, cheaper, and more inclusive. However, these benefits can only be realized if significant challenges and risks are addressed. I think yesterday you debated extensively challenges relating to monetary policy, financial stability, if not supervised, money laundering, terrorist financing, data privacy, consumer protection, tax compliance, and there on the top comes competition. Here I would like to insist that all these risks need to be tackled in a holistic manner by balancing the pros and cons, and competition risks are only one of many. So, despite the existence of a number of concerns relating to particular developments, the European Commission welcomes the innovation brought about in the financial services sector by the blockchain revolution. Competition enforcement complements and reinforces the effects of EU regulation. For example, many of you may be familiar with the Payment Services Directive, which establishes a regulatory framework which aims to open up the EU payment market to companies offering consumer or business-oriented payment services based on access to specific information about payment accounts. So this directive aims at putting at equal footing, for instance, fintechs and banks. Nonetheless, there may be instances where such sector regulation is not present or its scope is limited. And there, the only way to tackle impediments and barriers in the markets is competition enforcement. Bearing in mind the technological evolution and market changes are happening at a very fast pace, it is important for the Commission to take timely and effective enforcement action, and that means not only ex post, but also very often be proactive through advice and advocacy. Coming now to the specific concerns that could be linked to digital platforms. So those are multiple and varied. I will try to be as succinct as I can. The first one, as you can imagine, relates to access to data in general, because having more data can help businesses to understand their customers' needs better. It can allow them to develop the best artificial intelligence, but most importantly, perhaps, data can help them to target advertising to exactly the right audience for a product or a service. Therefore, an increased access to data would benefit both businesses and consumers. The competitiveness of financial service firms will increasingly depend on real-time access to relevant big data sets and the ability to use them to develop innovative market intelligence products. Actually, big tech firms are using their customer data to enter into the payment sector, but they also expand to adjacent markets. For instance, in retail and SME financial markets, digitization and retail connectivity are increasing, notably through mobile phone applications and online sales platforms serving micro businesses and SMEs. They allow for the use of behavioral data to refine or develop new retail financial services such as just-in-time insurance or short-term credit. The power of such platforms could have to use and license such data could give rise to competition concerns. Same in wholesale capital markets. Alternative data, that is real-time data on firm performers or consumer-related behavioral data, is increasingly being used by hedge funds and asset managers. It is important to note that not all limitations of data access constitute restrictions of competition. Data needs to be collected, formatted, and made available at fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. Should access to data be subject to specific licensing conditions, such conditions should favor and not restrict competition. In this sense, licensing conditions should be set at reasonable prices, not bundle unrelated data categories, and be provided in a timely manner. Now, in the retail banking market, One of the data-related issues which has come to the fore is the perceived asymmetry in supervisory and data portability regulation applicable to big techs as compared to banks. It is held that big tech's entry into retail finance may be facilitated by the asymmetric data access conditions that are regulated in the market. Banks are obliged to provide access, in particular under the Payment Services Directive I mentioned before. This access condition would not apply to fintechs and big techs. They are not obliged to give their data. So there is a lot of discussion what would be a fair, symmetric remedy. However, there I would suggest caution because full symmetry would not be a proportionate remedy. The Payment Services Directive only obliges banks to provide certain data on bank accounts and not all types of data. Coming to data interoperability and portability. The emergence of ecosystems and the complementarity of services with one another and with devices is an important element of competition. Devices belonging to different ecosystems are nowadays simply required to be able to be used together. The production and delivery of financial services requires different operators in the value chain to cooperate and interact. With interoperability, new entrants can be encouraged to also build complementary services. Instead of a straightforward refusal to provide data access, company can achieve similar outcomes by creating obstacles to effective data interoperability with third-party data, for example, by imposing unfavorable conditions or requesting disproportionate compensation. This cannot be tolerated unless there is an acceptable justification. Also, it has to be borne in mind that there are provisions in European law, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, where the right to data portability is included. Another important set of concerns in terms of competition is linked to network effects arising from platforms. Network effects help scale businesses by increasing customer base rapidly, market share, and the overall value proposition of a product or service. For consumers, network effects can also have a positive effect, given that the value of a product or a service has increased value for the consumer the more people use it. In this regard, a consumer decision whether to buy a product or use a service will be based on the number of other users already using the product. Nowadays, when a user buys a phone, their decision could be based on the number and type of applications that are available on the platform. However, network effects can also raise competition concerns. For example, anti-competitive network effects may be created by big techs, leveraging their market power from search into payment services or from online marketplaces into the working capital trade credit markets. The leveraging of market power by platforms in the financial services sector is most likely in those markets or niches which are not or are least regulated. Another set of issues relates to exclusionary conduct. This refers to incumbent actors foreclosing innovative third-party market entrants to the detriment of consumers and investors. Such conduct can be, for example, the result of cooperation between banks or insurance to exclude new entrants challenging their business models. They can also be achieved by the acquisition at birth of digital challenges and fintech startups. Also, the governance rules of associations of undertakings may have similar exclusionary effects. Therefore, such rules should not prevent access to a jointly created infrastructure or data pool. They should be, in principle, open to members fulfilling the relevant criteria and apply fair, objective, and non-discriminatory criteria, terms, and conditions. Exclusionary conduct in emerging digital financial solutions may take place in many different constellations. For instance, such a situation may arise with respect to closed blockchain networks, when access to the network by new entrants is denied by other participants, or the gatekeeper of the relevant blockchain. Now, there are some further concerns linked to artificial intelligence and algorithmic trading. Algorithmic trading is increasingly becoming artificial intelligence trading, whereby competing algorithms on platforms run by asset managers or investment banks are used to determine trades to optimize returns on investment. So in certain circumstances, if misunderstood and unchecked, these systems could passively adopt cartel-like behavior. The same concerns could apply in the context of blockchain platforms. There again, the intelligence should not be used in order to monitor prices. Looking forward, artificial intelligence used for trading decisions running on real-time market plus alternative data feeds will increasingly consist of artificial intelligence systems choosing across differing pools of algorithms that can favor consolidation of and vertical and horizontal integration of incumbent stock exchanges, but also integration of trading platforms or venues generating on vending data. Two last sets of concerns which I will touch upon very briefly. One is industry standards. Industry standards are precisely very important because they can support interpenetration in the market, and also in the context of the internal market, they can also contribute to market integration. But again, they have to be established in fair, reasonable, and not discriminatory terms. And the same the same applies when it comes to commercially sensitive information. Exchanging information can be very favorable in terms of developing innovative products and solutions. Nevertheless, attention should be given when it comes to pricing data. For instance, in the context of blockchain networks, competitors who are part of the same blockchain network may be able to exchange commercially sensitive information, for instance, relating to strategic data, given that each of them keeps an identical record of all transactions within the distributed ledger. So, in concluding, as a general remark, I would like to state that regardless of whatever mix of policies and measures we eventually choose to promote competition in digital markets, we must move forward on the basis that due to the characteristics of these markets, including notably the network effects I mentioned before, the risk of under-enforcement is just as harmful to innovation and competition as is that of over-enforcement. So authorities, competition authorities like the one I belong to myself, must act based on solid evidence and sound legal and economic principles, but they must be able to take action before anti-competitive practices achieve their goal and harm becomes irreparable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's interesting to see that even within the competition and how we try to do that the recurring theme seems to be interoperability. I see a lot on GDPR coming back, and obviously we're grateful to have bodies like this that will basically make sure that there's some regulation around this. My pleasure now is to introduce to you our next panel by Mr. Chris Burke, all the way from Melbourne, Australia. Like we said earlier, this is a true global organization. He will moderate the panel. I would like to see the slide of Slido come up, because we really want you to encourage you to also ask questions. We have Slido. You can go to slido.com and fill in the word convergence. And when you do that, you can ask questions and you can vote for questions. And I'm certain that Chris will take those questions and ask them to the right panelists. Anyway, here's Mr. Chris Burke, the co-director of RMIT, Blockchain Innovation, all the way from Melbourne, Australia. Thank you. Thank you very much. Everything's there.
Thank you very much for having me. I'd like to invite what I think is going to be a very exciting panel onto the stage to talk about visions of the decentralized big tech platform. So the first person I'd like to invite to the stage is Lee Brenner. He's the head of blockchain policy at Facebook, a small company you may have heard. I'd like to invite Ling Wu, who's the CEO of TBCA Soft. Takeshi Fukuizumi, he's the head of FinTech and Blockchain at SoftBank. Please, gentlemen, have a seat. This is a very exciting panel for me. I was reading last week, in fact, a paper by David Chaum, the legendary cryptographer David Chaum, and he spelt out a vision for two futures of the decentralized or the computerized global economy, writing this paper in 1985. And in one vision he saw was a global economy that was highly centralized, that large firms had large quantities of data and were using it to build hierarchies. On the other side, though, he also saw an alternative vision was a decentralized economy where people had much more control over their own personal data and their IP. And I think the conversation that we're having right now in the blockchain space, particularly on this panel, is that tension. Is that tension between the crypto-anarchist vision of the world that many of us got excited by when we first heard of Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies or blockchain, and the reality that we actually need and should be encouraging large firms to be involved in this space, to be experimenting in this space, and to be deploying their resources, their intellectual capital, their financial capital to build out that decentralized economy. So this is a really exciting panel. Now, I thought the first way that we might start this panel, however, is actually just very briefly get each panelist to explain their projects. Now, we should have slides, hopefully coming up. Yes, fantastic. We do have slides. System works, gentlemen. Takeshi, I might get you to very quickly just explain your project and how you think about this.
So let me introduce myself briefly. So I'm from SoftBank Corporation. So SoftBank Corporation is just a telecommunication carrier in Japan. And the parent company is SoftBank Group. That is investment company. So I'm from SoftBank Corporation, telecommunication carrier. So I'm not related to WeWork investment. So forget about it. And as a telecommunication carrier, we are now focusing on big data, AI, fintech. And because of carriers are regulated, highly regulated in Japanese regulation, so we cannot cross border without partnering other carriers. So we started, we SoftBank joined as initial members of Carrier Blockchain Study Group 2 years before. So first target is to create totally decentralized blockchain platform partnering with many carriers. So it's a Alipay is just example. It's a totally centralized architecture, but in CBSG, we are implementing a totally decentralized architecture. And our first target is retail payment, cross-border payment, and remittance. So creating a network connecting to PayPay, that's a QR-based offline payment company, which is called PayPay. So SoftBank is planning to implement this next year, commercialize. That is a brief introduction. Thank you.
Ling, I'll get you to explain your project.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone.
Eventually the slides will come up.
Next. It's recycling, okay. All right, so I will talk without slides. My name is Ling Wu. I play two roles. One is a founder and CEO of TBCA Soft. Someone say it's to be continued, but it's not. It's a telecom blockchain alliance software. So I just listened to Maria's statements that when we are building the blockchain network, we need new operators. So who will operate this network? Right now, the public networks like Bitcoin are operated by miners. We don't know who they are, and they are changing every single day. And if you look at the hash power of Bitcoin over the past 7 years, you see the powers are concentrated. The top 3 mining pools, they have more than 51% of the hash power, meaning they control the consensus. So Bitcoin network is not that distributed. 3 of them dominating more than 51% of hash power. So in order to run the blockchain applications at the right platform, we need to find an even platform and who will operate that. So our idea is telecos. Telecos are distributed. So we're a very distributed network. They have very high quality network qualities, so we can synchronize. So therefore, there's a lot of consensus algorithm can be run on top of that, which is impossible for public network. So SoftBank and TBCA, we have been working on that. So we formed a consortium called CBSG, Carrier Blockchain Study Group. We established that since 2017. In the past 2 years, we have already more than 20 operators, cover 1.5 billion operators, mobile network, the mobile phone numbers. So we have a lot of participations from Asia, America, South America, and Middle East. We don't have any operator joining from Europe. So European, what are you waiting for? Join the collaboration of CBSG. We will work together to define this platform. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Lee.
Thank you. My name is Lee Brenner. I manage public policy for blockchain at Facebook, but specifically work on our Calibra project and our subsidiary, newly created. And I've been working on the Libra project, which you might have heard about, for about a year. One of the things that we're really focused on is making sure that when we incubated the project, building a payment system that allowed people that currently don't have access, as we heard in the earlier talk, there's almost 2 billion people who don't have access to those financial services that many of us take for granted, to be able to access that in a new system and a new ecosystem and infrastructure that allows for faster, lower cost payments around the world. And really building something that has scalability, is very secure, but also is very safe for people, and really allows people to do cross-border payments and transact in a way that they haven't really been able to do before. So obviously with our scale and size, we think there's potential for it to be large, and you may have heard some reaction to our project because of that. But the reality is, from the Calibra side, we're building a wallet to be part of this ecosystem that ideally will have many competitors. We've built something in the Libra Association, and you heard yesterday about the association now has 21 members. Ideally, by the time this actually launches, it'll be around 100 running the blockchain, both companies, nonprofits. But the goal is that on top of that, there'll be it's an open platform so that anybody can build on top of it, and their interoperability is a key factor of this, so that when those payments happen, if you are using Calibra or if you're using another wallet service or another service that is built on top of the Libra network, all of which will be interoperable. So right now, those systems are very siloed, whether that's regional systems or even as an example, within the United States, there are systems within banks, or if you're using a wallet service, you can't necessarily send money to each other on that system. We think that there's a way that it can be built where there's interoperability that lowers costs and is done in a responsible way that addresses regulatory concerns around the world.
Thank you. So I might open with a question for Takeshi, and but everybody should have a go at this as well. So, what do you think the attraction is of blockchain for large firms? So for the corporate sector, given the decentralized nature of blockchain technology. Another way maybe of asking this question is: are large firms acting against their own self-interest here? Are they laying the foundation for a decentralized world that doesn't include large firms?
Okay, from SoftBank point of view, I started the research on blockchain about 4 years ago, and my understanding about blockchain is very good at to do cross-border something. So I targeted to cross-border payment and remittance, and I look for many technologies, and one of that is a TBC Soft. I started working with that company about 2 years ago. So that is a history of SoftBank. And my interest is how to, there's two issues. One is as a distributed ledger. So trust is created by blockchain technology. DLT is trustworthy. And the other one is token design. So the trust of value, digital value, is totally different from trust of DLT. So another interest is token design. So that is an ongoing process inside SoftBank. That is.
Okay, so the question was how big tech react to distributed technologies. So many people ask me the questions, hey, is blockchain good for everything? The answer is no. Blockchain is just a database, and it's a very inefficient database. You need to keep a lot of copies distributed everywhere. So, so only the data that you need a consensus for is good for blockchain. Okay, so I heard a project talking about using blockchain to store your family photos. I don't know, do you need consensus about your family photos, right? So payment is the right thing because you have a discrepancy of the data qualities. So the big tech is a result of TCP/IP evolvement. In the internet, it breaks borders. So internet create big tech. So big tech utilize central computer to collect as much information as possible and sell differently. For example, Facebook, we all contribute our content. They don't sell our content, but they collect the content and sell advertisements. When you need a consensus, you need multiple parties. If we trust Google, I use Google Map. Why do they need to use distributed technology to reach a consensus? But when you need to do something, you need consensus, you need multiple parties. So I think there's a different philosophy to implement database. If I want to build a search engine that everyone can come here to search for me, I'm not going to use distributed technologies. I will build Google like Google did. But if you want to, the problem with the internet is the more data you generate, the less likely you can trust the data. When I was in college, we went to the libraries for informations. You don't have that much information in the library, but you can trust the information that inside the library. My sons, they don't go to libraries, they go to Google. And there's a lot of information on Google, which information you should trust. And someone controlling what you see. You know, there's a lot of contents on Google, but who is controlling how many pages you see? What's the first page you can see that? It was controlled by someone. I think this is, when internet go to the extreme, we start not trusting people, right? So there's a fake news, there's a fake everything. So when you're building a trust, you need counterparty to check each other's. So the philosophy of big tech and distributed consensus trust is totally different. So that's...
Lee, I'd like to give you the same question, but just make it a tad sharper. In the blurb to this session, one of the sentences was something like, are we getting a decentralized Facebook? Is a decentralized Facebook good for Facebook? Or is something about to really significantly change?
So I would say, I mean, look, our focus, especially in the blockchain space, has been on this project, on Calibra and Libra. And I don't necessarily think that, to Ling's point, that blockchain and distributed platforms are going to be implemented into every system. For us, we saw it as a way for the payment system and recognizing that the trust factor in a blockchain system would be applicable with what has become Libra. So that's where our focus has been, and we think that as we continue to build out that and explore other ways that with data portability and other things that might be implemented, those could have effects on other parts of Facebook. But right now, the focus really has been on Libra and Calibra.
It strikes me that the vision of the future of the economy that these projects lead us to is towards large firms using shared digital infrastructure. Maybe not just large firms, but even community organizations, SMEs and so forth. Does that create regulatory questions? Are we worried about competition policy in that space? Bitcoin is a permissionless network, but some of the blockchain or DLT applications we're talking about here are controlled by their members. So they're distributed, but they can be exclusionary. Are we concerned, or do you think that is a concern that regulators should be thinking about?
I can start. I know when we were thinking about Libra, we specifically said that one firm, whether it's Facebook or anyone else, or one company, should not be controlling the system. And I think as blockchains have developed, there obviously are full permissionless systems. There are those that are fully permissioned. We think that there is a hybrid in between, where there's to have scale, to have the ability to lower costs and be secure and be compliant with regulatory concerns that are out there, that are legitimate, that are being brought up. It needs to be a system that the members that are running it are trusted actors in the system, but then it's an open platform so that people can actually, and have small businesses and others can access that infrastructure, right? And so you don't have to necessarily be a member to be a part of the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think the most important factor of a blockchain is trust. You want to create trust among multiple parties. So the question should be, what is the best way to create a trust so multiple parties can agree with? If some company in the United States create something, China may not trust. If China creates something, Japan may not trust. So when it goes to an area that's shared with a common interest, I think it should be regulated somehow. So Maria just mentioned about the symmetric remedy. I think that's very, very important. So that's why we chose to work with global telcos. So telcos, every country has two industries that are highly regulated: banks and telecommunications. And every country has their own telco that the government can regulate it. So I think that's very important. Different from internet. Internet is totally boundaries. It's difficult to regulate it. But blockchain need regulation to regulate.
I think the problem of Bitcoin is, in the blockchain world, it's perfect working, but it's not related to real world. Connection to real world is just a very weak exchange companies. So some companies are hacked, like a Mt. Gox is hacked by someone. And so my opinion is, initially blockchain should be a permissioned blockchain where only a trustworthy entities can connect to a real world. So in CPS design, it's only telecom carrier can create a blockchain node, and it connects to a, for example, bank account to exchange to US dollar or Japanese yen. That is an important design to make blockchain to be regulated rightly. So that is one thing. The other thing is maybe it's a different opinion. It's a blockchain can be applied to everything. No. So most of big tech player is doing a kind of matching service. Matching service is, for example, Uber is making matching between driver and passenger, or seller and buyer, and house owner and tourist in Airbnb. So creating matching business, maybe blockchain is not efficient. Blockchain is not good for search. So to do that, maybe big tech player will create a centralized database to do that. But in payment or ID management, it can be decentralized. So in CBSG design, it's actually each identity management and authentication should be done by each telecom carrier. And blockchain platform is a unified blockchain, but just recording a payment transaction. That design can be maybe regulation friendly. So that is my opinion.
Takeshi, you spent a lot of time working on building into these systems the regulatory requirements. It strikes me that around the world, we tend to regulate companies. When we're imposing requirements on the economy, we look at firms and we say, okay, well, this is a requirement that a firm has to abide by, whether it's KYC or anti-money laundering. What are the, do you think that the future of this technology is going to be shaped by that requirement? Are there regulatory reasons that we would expect a great deal of innovation in business or in existing firms rather than the startup community?
Yeah. In reality, CBSG design, I'm always thinking about which should be inside the blockchain, which can be outside the blockchain. So everyone thinking about, all the information goes inside the blockchain. In reality, no. So in CBS design, KYC, AML is outside the blockchain, and it's role and responsibility of each carrier. And that kind of system not changed by blockchain. It's already existing. KYC operation, all telecom carrier has some KYC operation. So the important thing is to create some standardized API to communicate to blockchain, to keep the responsibility clear. So that is a current implementation design. I'm not sure this is the answer for you.
I would add, I think it is a challenge when there isn't regulatory clarity around the world, right? So for companies that are currently regulated to go into a space and to innovate in something that doesn't have regulatory clarity, it's probably difficult for them. But I think the more that there can be regulatory clarity around the world, and it doesn't have to be uniform, country by country, but there are legitimate concerns from anti-money laundering and counterterrorism questions, any sort of illicit finance, which the current regulations were written a long time ago and don't necessarily apply to this new technology, but there are also then, challenges between privacy concerns versus law enforcement concerns, right? So figuring out how to balance those is really important, and making sure that you're working with regulators. And I think it's interesting that now we're in this new innovative space where regulators and companies are trying to work together to figure this out, opposed to doing it somewhat after the fact, which is often, as you were kind of talking about, happens, where they're going to regulate a company for doing something, where they're trying to, I think regulators are very much trying to be in the forefront as much as possible as this innovation is happening.
So in the consortiums, we talk to a lot of regulators. We talk to Asian regulators, we talk to Middle East, South America. We haven't talked to European regulators. So I think we should talk. Okay.
You will soon after this session.
Right. So I realized they are not trying to regulate companies. I think they are regulating power. When power is concentrated, it has to be regulated. In human history, when the power is concentrated to one or a group of people, something happened. Most of the time, bad thing happens. So my understanding is a regulator want to regulate whoever owns too much power. From that sense point of view, I think we need to communicate with the regulators why this blockchain need adapt with a new way to regulate, like Lee mentions, right? A lot of rule has been written before the technology was invented. People don't even know this is such a way to do that. But yesterday when I hear Yuko Kawai-san's comments, I have a huge feeling. I think central banks, they actually think a lot of things. They also think advanced. And most importantly, they need to protect investor and users' benefits. They need to consider the integrity, market integrity. So we need to explain with them. I think blockchain can rewrite a lot of the way we are doing that, but we can do step by step. We don't have to one step ahead because that means we have a certain thing unknown. If you ask me, I have to tell you there's some issues in current cryptocurrencies that mathematical cannot prevent that from any fraud. Not yet. Maybe future we have this kind of new mechanism, but right now we don't. Do we want to do one big step forward or we do step by step? When it involves a lot of common interest, I think we need to do step by step. That's what I feel.
That's a rather radical vision of the future, though, in vision of the regulatory space, though, because if we're regulating power, and we don't have a Power Act or something like that, but we're trying to regulate centers of power in the economy for lots of different reasons, to protect consumers, to make sure that environmental and social goals are met. But now we're talking about a decentralized version of power, where power is shared across, in fact, jointly governed by consortia, jointly governed by token holders, by token voters, whoever holds Bitcoin or so forth. That's a really significant change. I might throw this to you, Lee, because you're obviously thinking about this in the context of building out a monetary framework that is both distributed and a challenge to the existing monetary system.
I think it can be, but I think if it's done responsibly, that both can work in unison, right? So
you have to say that, though.
Yeah, but I think it's true. I mean, the reality is we proposed, and there's been concerns brought up about monetary policy and currency sovereignty, but we see, from our project, something that lives alongside that. Our Libra, the concept behind Libra is that it's backed by actual currencies, right? Real government-backed currencies. That's what brings its trust, right? So those need to exist for Libra to exist. And we've called for regulation from major, governments to make sure that stays in effect and make sure that there's no fractional reserve and other things. And the Libra Association is working on that. But I think that these issues that are coming up, I don't think it has to be seen as either or. There are some, as you said, that in this space who want to go live on islands and do not want governments involved at all. But the reality is that's not going to happen. That's just not the way the world works. And for it to be something that has a good effect on and access for the most amount of people, we're going to have to live and work in these systems that work pretty well. And we think that there can be improvements. And that's really the goal of any of this technology, is to make sure that it improves on the current system and gives more people access.
But there's going to be the need for, whether it's in Libra or across really any of the domains the blockchain can affect, there's going to be need for quite significant regulatory change and significant regulatory reform. Do you think that policymakers understand this, or are they applying old models to new businesses?
I would say that not all regulators are the same, right? I think there are some that are clearly trying to apply old models. I think there are some that are being more innovative and recognize that they don't want to stifle innovation, but they want to make sure that's done safely. And many of the conversations that we've had and around the world have been very constructive. And I think both everything from the European Commission and the United States and in Africa and other places where people recognize the potential of the technology, they still need to kind of wrap their heads around what it can mean. And to Ling's point, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to regulate and everything has to be regulated 20 years out, right? Because we don't necessarily know what the innovation will be 5, 10 years from now, right? If you think about if people weren't regulating social media 15 years ago, and many of the laws that we're working on now, because it didn't exist, right? And people weren't using it. So they have to think through what's happening right now and try to do it in the way that is both responsible and making sure that this innovation in companies and whether it's central banks or others can also continue to innovate.
Yeah, so I think the distributed technology is not distributing the power. It's distributing the way we make a consensus. Who define the truth? Before blockchains, you need to trust someone. I put my money in Bank of America. I just need to trust Bank of America unconditionally. If my personal record is not the same as a Bank of America record, I surrender, right? Because we choose to trust them. So blockchain provide a new way to define what is the truth. The truth is defined by consensus of distributed parties. It doesn't mean that we are distributing the power. It's distributing the way to make the consensus. Of course, that can be manipulated when that translates, because when I can define how much money you have, I certainly have the power. We need to explain to the regulators how this is going to change the way you have been regulated in the past 200 years. Right. So I think we have the responsibility to explain that. Regulators, they have a concern because they want to protect common public's interest. And we have the responsibility to explain and also give them suggestions. The first step is maybe you want to do this. You don't need to take 10 steps in one time. It's too much, like French cuisine. You don't eat at the same time, but you have appetizer, you got wine, and then eventually you get dessert. I think blockchain is a French cuisine. I don't need you to eat in 5 minutes, right? You can take 2 hours to do that with step by step. With that, it's a very good cuisine, but don't eat at the same time. We define the plan and explain how that works. I think we can work very well together.
Slightly different opinion, but at least P2P value transfer can make more diversity to wallet service providers. So personally, I don't want to register my credit card number to Amazon or Alipay. So it's giving my wallet to Amazon or Alipay. And if I made a payment, it goes through from Amazon to payment gateway to credit card companies and go to issuer side system, and from issuer side to actually payer bank account. It's a very inefficient, long process. So I don't want to give my credit card number. So if P2P value transfer is available, smaller e-commerce site can survive, getting easy to get money from payer side. That is one possibility.
So I want to emphasize that in a couple of minutes we'll be able to take questions. If you use the Slido app, you can give your own questions or vote on other questions. One thing I will ask the whole panel individually, though, before we get to those questions, is all of you have spent a lot of time talking to regulators and working with regulators, not just in the jurisdictions that you're based, but around the world. If we want policymakers and regulators to facilitate this technology, not just stand out of the way, but help it achieve the goals that it can achieve, what is best practices as you see it? And Lee, I might start with you. What's a good regulator look like?
I think the most important thing is understanding the technology and its implications, right? And not necessarily every nuance. I mean, people often ask, how blockchain works, and I say to them, well, you don't really know how email works.
So you explain to them for half an hour what a hash function is,
right. And they don't necessarily need to know all of that detail necessarily. But knowing the implications and how it's going to affect people is really important. And I think educating people on what the truth is beyond the headlines is really important so that people can, and regulators can make smart decisions as to how any regulation that is proposed will affect that innovation either now and a few years out. So we want to make sure that the regulation is focused on what is happening now, but also is looking forward to saying that make sure that the innovation can continue to happen, because in the end, the more that innovation happens from private firms, I think regulators and citizens, which is what they should be looking after, will benefit.
So Chris, I think there's no good or bad regulators. I think important thing is
this is an unusual opinion.
I think we need to understand we are coming from different points. Yesterday I was so inspired by Kawai-san's point. She mentioned 4 things, and she thinks cryptocurrency solved one problem, but there's other 3 that she has concern. I think this is very important. When any new technology is invented, it improves something, but there's certain thing unknown. I think it's important we need to communicate and also learn from regulators. Regulators has their own job. Their job is to keep things secure. Entrepreneurs' job is different. We want to break the status quo. Regulators, they have a different responsibility. I think we need to understand each other well, so we understand their concerns, so we can adjust the pace of using the new technology to define the old way we have been doing. Especially, we are talking about the trust. The trust is the most difficult things that human can maintain. Okay, not even in the family, you want to establish full trust between you and your wife, kids. Is not that easy. Don't even mention we are talking about the trust at the global scale. So we need to communicate. So what I want to say is we want to understand, for example, EU commissions. What's your concern about that? I don't know. I know you have a huge concern about privacy. How can we use this technology? So we manipulate technology, not being manipulated by the new technology.
Yeah. Regulators should understand more deeply about how it will be implemented. So for example, Facebook, Libra. So I know Facebook is totally separated from Calibra and Libra Association. I believe it's a very good design. But if Facebook ID is, most of Facebook ID related to Calibra ID, it will make indirectly Facebook dominant power. So, but it's not coming from blockchain technology. It's coming from actual service design, how consumer is going to use Calibra wallet. So regulators should understand which is related to blockchain itself, or it should be outside blockchain. So that kind of thing, regulators should understand more deeply.
Yeah, we need to explain.
Yeah, we have to explain.
So I think we've got questions now, which I'm hoping that either comes up on the slide or, hey, check that out. How do you explain the exit of PayPal, MasterCard, eBay, etc. from the Libra Association? I'm getting, yeah, so Lee. Lee.
So I think, a few weeks ago, 21 members actually signed interim charter of the Libra Association, Facebook and Calibra being one of them. When we announced it in June, there were other members, but I think you'll have to honestly talk to the individual companies as to why exactly they decided not to sign on. But I think the reality is there was enormous amount of political pressure that was public to some of these companies, in the United States and other places. And I think the reality is it's a challenge, and because again there isn't regulatory clarity. I think it would probably make sense for a company that is highly regulated currently in the space, when they're being basically told by United States senators and others that their current business is going to be looked at stringently if they join this association. I think the reality is risk versus reward on a project that isn't guaranteed to happen immediately, and I think they need to think through how they're going to apply it. They probably made the decision from their perspective of their board. Let's wait until there's more regulatory clarity. The reality is they can still be involved in the system because it's an open ecosystem. Any of those companies can still absolutely build on top of the Libra blockchain and or be part of it at a later date.
To follow that up, some of the letters that I saw from US politicians were quite threatening in a lot of ways. And, my view is that that was because of the threat they potentially saw to the monetary system. But do you think that that's a problem? There's enough discretion in a regulatory framework or political framework that they can actually try to hold back these sort of revolutionary changes?
Personally, I think it's important that the innovation continues to happen. I think the idea of trying to stop something, and again, it's important to note that all we did was announce plans to do something way in advance of doing it in order to have conversations with regulators and policymakers way in advance. Not necessarily something that most tech companies often do. So by doing that, obviously we opened up the conversation and we think it's important to make sure that that conversation continues, but the idea of stopping something simply because of the idea of it is not a good thing.
Ling, without asking you exactly why Visa left, a platform that you're not involved in. This is an interesting challenge, though, isn't it? That some of what we do in this space directly challenges regulatory assumptions, policy-making frameworks that have existed not just for decades, but even hundreds of years in the case of monetary systems. Do you see that as a big challenge for you when you're thinking about your project at a strategic level, that you might be challenging some of the policymakers' most core understandings of their own position in the world?
Yes, we do. So in the consortium, one of the first use cases is also cross-border payment. So we built a system called Cross-Carrier Payment System, CCPS. We leverage carriers' KYC and the account to facilitate the payment. So of course we need to talk to regulators. They have certain concern, and we design a way that eliminates the concerns. For example, our blockchain don't create cryptocurrencies. We use blockchain to create ledgers. So we are a database company. We tell regulators we have a very reliable database that all the possible other databases you have, because the existing database needs someone to host it. This is a central clearing house. And we providing another database, not cryptocurrencies, to improve the data integrities and to eliminate the single point of value. At the end, we still go to the financial rail to do the real settlement. So when we explain to the regulators, they say, oh, of course, oh, that's good. You are just another database. But you are using blockchain working together with entity which I can regulate it on data to provide the services. Of course, it's not as efficient as Libra. I think Libra is a holy grail. If we can reach that, that's even much, much better. But that addresses the three concerns that Kawai-san mentions. In terms of efficiency, we improve that, but we also address that concern. So yeah, we spend a lot of time to learn, to adjust the model, how do we use that? So that's the way the consortium use. And you understand, telecos are very, very conservative. One of the most conservative industry. So to work with them, you need to make them comfortable. So that's the way we operate blockchain.
Takeshi, very quickly, you're at the coalface. What do you tell regulators when they have these fundamental concerns?
Yeah, our project is very, very technology-oriented project, so we are not well trained to explain to regulators. It's a reality. But in reality, I don't see serious problem. It's because of already telecom carrier doing KYC and user authentication and merchant authorization. It's not changed. Just using blockchain database as a secure transaction record. So maybe I can explain briefly about regulators. Maybe I hope I don't see a serious issue about that.
Sure. I'd like to thank Lee Brenner, Ling Wu, and Takeshi Fukuizumi for their time on stage. Thank you.
Chris, thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Chris, and panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. So that was a great panel on visions of the decentralized big tech platforms. I love the way how we started with two opposites. Is it either going to be the bigger corporations, or is it going to be total anarchy? I think, again, what we're doing here is trying to build bridges between industries and regulators moving forward. So again, now I'd like to welcome to the stage Stefan Appel. He's the managing partner of Outlier Ventures, and he will talk to us about, with his panel, about the challenges of pushing permissionless innovation. So, Stephen. Okay, so we will encourage the people, also encourage the people to ask questions through Slido.
Yes.
Yes? Okay, thank you.
Can people hear me? Yeah. I'm Stefan Appel, managing partner of Outlier Ventures. We are a venture platform that supports teams and technologies for an open data economy. And coincidentally, in 2016, we published our investment thesis that was called Convergence. And it described how decentralized ledger technologies are going to scale other technologies such as artificial intelligence. So it's a great pleasure to be here today and to be able to moderate this panel with these great speakers about challenges to pushing permissionless innovation. And I would like to introduce my fellow panelists. Maybe we start with Julie Maupin from the IOTA Foundation. Then we got Arthur Brightman from Tezos. And Lon Wong from NEM originally, and now Proxima X. Do we maybe have another microphone? In the meantime, let's maybe we can share the microphone. So, challenges to permissionless innovation. It's a very broad topic, and we can touch on a lot of different topics, and we've just seen the panel before that touched on regulatory aspects already. But maybe we start a bit earlier, and we go back to when a project is founded. Typically, there's a team of a few people, maybe one founder only. And how do you go from growing a project from a small team to a permissionless protocol or ecosystem? And how do you, in particular, take a step from a very centralized governance to maybe a more decentralized or independent governance? And maybe we start with Julie, if that's fine.
Sure. Thanks for having me here today. And I'm wearing my IOTA hat now, as opposed to the ANAPA one from yesterday. I was involved in helping to set up the IOTA Foundation a couple of years ago. And for those of you who don't know, IOTA was the first nonprofit foundation to be set up in the European Union. We have our headquarters in Berlin, that was founded with an endowment that was consisted of cryptocurrency donations. So it was an extremely complicated thing to work through together with the German regulatory authorities to help them understand what does it mean to have an endowment that's not in euros but in a cryptocurrency, in IOTA tokens. But you know, there are a lot of challenges of doing permissionless innovation and trying to build something at scale, from something that started as a community project where you just have, you know, developers getting to know each other through online forums like Bitcoin Talk and Reddit and you know, various different places where developers meet and chat online about projects they find interesting. You know, and going from that to establishing a fully regulated nonprofit foundation in Germany is a really, really long road. And you have a lot of surprising challenges along the way. I'll give a couple of examples. So when you do permissionless innovation, one of the things you have is you have an open community and ecosystem of developers who are just committing code, just contributing for free. They're donating their time. You don't necessarily know who they are. Everybody has handles online, and they sort of emerge over time as, wow, this person has great ideas and commits great code. And I remember at one point, after we had managed to successfully set up the foundation, there was one developer who was contributing great ideas to the development of the first IOTA wallet, the Trinity wallet. And we said, hey, let's bring this person into the foundation. Can we somebody find out who he is, and let's see if he wants to come and work for the foundation. Well, it turned out it was a 16-year-old kid in Delaware. And he's a brilliant developer, but obviously you can't hire a 16-year-old to work for your foundation because he has to go to school, and he was just doing this for fun at night because he likes programming. So things like that happen all the time, and you really have to be agile. You have to be able to harness the talent around the world. Even though you don't necessarily know, where that next great contributor is going to come from. And putting in place the structures for that to make it possible to do that is not an easy task.
Thanks. Maybe Arthur?
I think part of the challenge is that a lot of people are actually desperate for centralization. They want centralization. They will say, oh, it's decentralized, it's great, but where's the center? And you see this with interacting with the press, for example, interacting with large companies, large groups, or bodies like the European Union, for example. All of these actors, they basically say like, okay, but who am I talking to? I get this all the time. People say like, oh, you're Tezos, right? And no, I'm not. I mean, I was involved in co-founding the project many years ago. But today, if you look at Tezos, it's a set of, there are companies working on Tezos in Japan, there are companies in France, in the US, in Switzerland, it's everywhere in the world, and not a single one of them can speak for the network itself. And people hate that. They're like, oh yeah, I get it, but, and it's very, very, very difficult to get it in people's mind because they are very much in the mindset of, I want to deal with an interlocutor that speaks with authority that has somehow some sort of official mandate. And you can't have that in a decentralized network. You can't have an official mandate. And that makes it very, I think that makes it very tricky to interface with the rest of the world.
Thanks.
Hi, good morning. I've gone through a very interesting path in this space. It all started with some of these founders in the early days of the need and the want to change the way Bitcoin was designed and the way some of the projects were designed in the early days, even before Ethereum was hatched. And that was in 2013, 2014. And what actually came out of that is the passion about developing something that's new. And in fact, we didn't even raise money at the time. We only raised $100,000 worth of contribution, but we all worked for free air. We live on free air. And subsequently, we grew into a huge sort of project, and that was NEM, right? And that was in 2015, 2017, and 8. So I spent 4 years on it, and it was a very painful exercise because most of the time I traveled the world promoting the technology free of charge. And that's how we all started. So it was more passion of the founders of the project rather than the monetary gains coming out of it. But the world has changed today. And it has changed a lot in 2016 to 2018, where there was, a huge dip and basically a shakeout of all sorts of projects. And it is increasingly hard as founders today to be able to promote a new project. I think gone are the days, and that's where permissionless projects any good ones will come out of what is in existence today more so than what is in existence tomorrow, because it's not going to happen too soon anymore. So to wrap around on your question is the founders of yesteryear, which is about 4 or 5 years ago, was more on passion. Today is more driven by the need to raise funds so that they can move forward. And lest we forget, a lot of things have happened in the last 2 years where many of these projects have come in and gone after raising a substantial amount of money. So this is where the problem is again with permissionless blockchain projects that we have today.
Thank you very much. And you're actually touching on a very interesting topic, which is funding. You know, usually there's funding required to grow a project, and we have about 100 startups or project teams that come to us every single month and want to engage with us in some form or another. What are you observing about the change of the funding landscape these days? You know, there's always a discussion about utility, you know, at what point is there utility? And we touched on at what point do you go independent for governance? How does that impact the funding of projects at different stages?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. This is my personal view. This is how I've been viewing it for the last 4 or 5 years, 6 years in fact. The challenge we have today is utility. Utility, then we had tokenomics, you know. It is an enhanced word or jargon to utility. Everything was about utility, but if you look at the entire landscape today, utility is almost zero. There's no utility. There are talks about utility, but there's no utility in a permissionless network. Permissionless network means, in my opinion, a public blockchain where you use the native token to drive the existence of the network. And for that to exist, even with the most established one, which is the Bitcoin blockchain, we still have problem. There's no real utility other than the store of value, which is now which has taken the pole position, right? And which is the de facto reserve currency of the crypto landscape. But other than that, we don't see utility. Even with Ethereum, it was just, you know, smart contracts, but there's no real utility that would drive to see it through to the next 15 years, 20 years from here. And projects are dying on that basis. So to move on and to raise funds for this sort of projects is increasingly very hard and almost impossible. So much so that the way I look at it is that the security tokens will come in place, and we will morph ourselves as an industry moving towards mainstream applications and mainstream where real money comes in to finance projects and finance initiatives that allow us to keep going at it. So I think that is where I'm seeing how in the next couple of years, the security tokens or, you know, whatever tokens in the form of security will come on stream and allow us to raise more serious money so that projects, new projects, can move forward. So this is how my 2 cents is with regards to raising money and projects. As I said earlier, projects today, whatever good projects that will come out are projects that have been in existence since 2018 rather than 2019, because it's nearing where you can't really raise money other than security tokens or security or issuance of shares to fund projects. And all projects that are being funded by huge tech companies like what Facebook is trying to do with Libra, and what Oracle is trying to do, or Microsoft is trying to do. Every one of these huge companies that are coming in. So they are also going to change the landscape. They are going to be dominant. But the fact of the matter is today we're talking about permissionless is hard.
Thanks.
Jump in on that point. If I could jump in on that point, I think it depends on what your notion is of utility. And you know, if you think of utility just in the narrow terms of, does this have utility as a money? Does it replace the euro or the yen or the dollar for me? Then it's difficult to think of the token that way. Because of the interaction with the traditional financial system and the fact that you have to pay your taxes in euros and dollars and yen. If you think of utility a bit more broadly, you know, as we do at IOTA, you know, in the IOTA distributed ledger technology, you can use the token for payments, but you can also use the network for secure data transfers without using the token. So there's no cost to transferring the value, transferring and securing the data, because you don't have to use a token and there's no mining associated with the setup of the technology. So, you know, it really enables micropayments, which was the whole point behind IOTA, to focus on the IoT space, to build the machine-to-machine economy, so that when I get in my electric car and I need to charge it somewhere and there's no public charging station available, my car can have a wallet built into it and it can drive up to the charging station at your house while you're at work and charge up and pay you, you know, electrons flowing one way and the payment flowing the other, and then just stop and drive on, without you and I having to enter into a contract, without me needing to know anything about your bank account details to transfer the money afterwards, et cetera. It's just directly machine to machine. And this is an enormous type of utility because it enables us to start really building smart cities and circular peer-to-peer economies, you know, which we desperately need to tackle problems like climate change. So I think if you think of utility more broadly, as utility in terms of, here I'm going to stick some money in here and hope that I get rich because the token goes up, is very much, I agree, you know, something of yesteryear that we shouldn't expect to see again. But what it does mean is it means that, you know, the projects that have good ideas, that have a reason for being around, that are serving a particular function. You know, IOTA is tackling the machine-to-machine economy. There are other projects that are really trying to solve privacy, working, you know, heavily pushing cryptography with zero-knowledge proofs and things like this. And there are specific projects, some that are working on smart contracts, which we don't do because you can't do smart contracts on tiny little devices. They're too big. So, so the projects that have a utility in terms of filling a function in the economy, in society, I think are the ones that are going to stick around. But we have to think of them as public utilities. And you know, that's how we think of IOTA. That's why we set it up as a nonprofit foundation. And you know, we won't be able to live forever on the token donations that were given to us, you know, by the ecosystem in the beginning, because you run out of money eventually, and we can't count on the token going up forever. If it did go up forever, it would be extremely unstable and nobody would use it for these you know, use cases that we're talking about. So we have to diversify our sources of funding by looking for grants and doing projects together with public sector actors and things like that, which has been, you know, my focus in my team for the last year and a half. You know, really to diversify the funding sources and also work with industrial partners, with corporate and startup actors who want to use IOTA as the rails in the same way that the basic technology that underlies the internet is the rails for moving information around the world, you know, to invest in those rails so that people can move payments around the world between machines. And it's kind of a public service. It's not something, you're not going to get rich on the rails. The money comes from the projects that you build on top of them.
Julie, I think Arthur wanted to
say. Sorry. So in this sense, I'm a bit of a blockchain skeptic. I think the blockchain was invented for a very specific purpose, which was to run a decentralized network where you could have a ledger. And the thing that you can represent that's decentralized on this ledger is basically money and not a whole lot else. And there was this very unfortunate turn of events where I think fundamentally blockchains and cryptocurrencies are extremely subversive. But a lot of people don't want to go on stage and talk about subversive things like political activism, for example. And as a result, there was a framing of this which was done, and people went on stage and said, no, it's about technology, it's new technology, it's blockchain technology. And there were consultants in the audience, and the consultant believed them. And they were like, that's great, blockchain technology. And then they went on to sell blockchain technology. But 99% of all the use cases you hear about blockchain technology, which are not strictly money or maybe some form of finance or some form of title transfer don't make any sense at all. The traceability of food doesn't make sense. Notarization doesn't really make sense. Most of these applications don't make any sense, and I see so many, especially large corporates or governments being interested in all of these blockchain projects because it has the word blockchain and it's like, oh, it's good, it's new technology, but it doesn't make sense. And I would enjoy everyone to just look at the technology, think at it from first principle. Almost none of these applications need a blockchain. If you look at it from a computer science perspective, the blockchain is a cost. It's like, you know what, you want to run this decentralized network and you want to be able to do all this thing, and like, oh man, you know what, I don't know how to do it without a blockchain. That sucks. I really don't want to have a blockchain because it's expensive in structure and it's slow and it's cumbersome, but I guess I can't do it without a blockchain. And I see a ton of projects where they don't need a blockchain, but they see it as a value add. They say like, we could do this and we could add a blockchain. And that doesn't make any sense. Now I hear you say like, oh, some projects have different use cases. Some are working on zero knowledge proof, some are working on smart contracts. Those are not use cases. Those are how you enable the use cases. Like you want smart contract because you want your money to be programmable. You want zero knowledge proof because you want your money to be private. But at the end of the day, whether you're doing micropayments, whether you're doing anonymous payments, whether you're doing programmable payments, everything's competing. It's not like everyone is going to find its own niche. I would say pretty much every public blockchain is competing with every public blockchain, and there's a very, very strong incentive, I think, that people have to say to pretend that they're differentiated. And there's some differentiation on a technological standpoint, but not on a use case standpoint. And a use case is first and foremost going to be internet money. And maybe that won't work. Maybe there won't be enough adoption. Maybe it will not become the money of the internet. We don't know. But let's not pretend that we can put a twist on these things and somehow make them about difference, make them about, I don't know, storing the license from that was a big thing in 2014. Everyone was like, yeah, we're going to put the warranty for your washing machine is going to go on a blockchain. No one talks about that anymore because it's passé. Now we're going to put plastic bags on a blockchain, all of these things. Please, it doesn't make sense. And I see governments spending millions of dollars or euros and hiring these consulting firms. They will hire Consensus and say, please, we want blockchain, tell us. And then Consensus will do this independent analysis and they will say, I know you should use this Ethereum. Or they will hire IBM, pay millions of dollars to IBM and say, oh, we have a problem. How can we deal with the Irish border? Oh, let's look at it. Yeah, you could probably use Hyperledger blockchain. That doesn't make sense, please. Look at this with open eyes.
Thanks. So maybe this brings us to another point, which is related to that. In such an ecosystem of a decentralized protocol or technology in general, who are the stakeholders in this new area, and who are in the traditional world, always startups used to try to, secure customers, users. Who are the users here in this world, and how do you grow adoption of such a community, of such an ecosystem?
There are a few stakeholders. One big stakeholder is the speculators, right? And they do nothing but speculate on the value of the crypto coin. Then there is the other stakeholder, which are the users of the platform. And again, as I was saying, the utility is few and far in between. Now the question arises. With the fact that we have 3,000 over different projects, many of them are derivatives of one another, but it doesn't matter. The fact of the whole thing is that if we want to store, we want to use it as micropayment, we have 3,000 different projects to make use of. And there's so few of us in the entire world that even understand what crypto is all about. So it's no utility. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to stamp the fact that after having spent 4 years on a project that had so much future and has so much future, we still have problems trying to address the issue of what we have been hearing today and yesterday, and it's very, very regulator-centric, very payment-centric, and this is one issue. Why can't I just pay Bitcoin, use Bitcoin to pay for my petrol with an Internet of Things that is adapted to the Ethereum blockchain, for example? Of course, then there will be debates about differentiators between one project and another, but that is not the point. That is purely academic, right? The bottom line is, who are the stakeholders? And I can see from here, the real stakeholders are those guys who are pushing the value of the coin and manipulating the value of the coin more so than the number of users there out there, the stakeholders. Because, as one gentleman pointed out yesterday, one of the panel speakers pointed out yesterday, there is an acute shortage of education of this whole thing. Because this whole thing revolves around a very nebulous theory of mathematics, as well as the complexity of trying to grasp and even understand what blockchain technology is all about. But it's a very simple thing. Some people have put it very simply. Some people have put it in a very complicated manner. But the bottom line is there is an acute lack of knowledge in the entire industry, as well as beyond what we are here today, the man and the lady on the street. And this is where the problem is. There's no stakeholders, and this is where Arthur was saying that you have people coming in here giving wrongful information to the end users, the potential end users, and not getting it right in the first place. So if you ask me who are the stakeholders, I can tell you, in my experience, that stakeholders today are more likely to be from the government, and I have since shifted my focus away from having to meet regulatory requirements, but to look at things like storage of what we call encrypted information, where practically it is impossible to crack. Of course, theoretically, mathematically, you can crack anything, right? But the thing is, these are the stakeholders, the governments that do not need to make transactions or money, not governed by monetary policies and frameworks, things like storage of information, and in fact, that is a prime mover, streaming of information, privacy of information. And when it comes to permissionless, I see that one of the biggest utility is the ability for us to go into the social media networks, the Facebooks of the world, the Twitters of the world, because increasingly we have an issue with privacy. And increasingly all these big traditional companies are actually looking at making money out of your information. And there is a need, and the need to actually make sure that all our information is privy to ourselves and not subject to the abuse or exploitation by a centralized entity of sorts. And these are probably the stakeholders that we will see. And in fact, this is what Proxima X is actually working towards. We have moved away from having to work on the financial side of things, although the platform we have, I like to call myself as a medicine man, right? Medicine man is a holistic, we have developed a platform. It's a holistic solution where you can actually make use of it as for financial fiat-driven e-wallet, which is not really found in the blockchain world today, fiat-driven, not a crypto wallet. Because fiat-driven is very much governed by regulatory requirements like money laundering, stop your payment, you lose your key, you cannot lose your wallet and lose all your money. There's no such things in the fiat world, right? So these are all the constraints that come with blockchain-driven fiat e-wallet. And then on the other extreme end of the scale, then we have things like medical health records, streaming of live data, whether it's video data or whether it's just message data, anything, streaming of data, binaries, right? And so on. So it's a spectrum. And the reason why we move towards this is because we need to address a spectrum of stakeholders as well. Because you cannot be addressing a small segment of the industries at large and having yourself hit the brick wall with the regulators. And therefore no utility, and therefore no stakeholders, and therefore the end of the project, right? So this is where, from my point of view, the stakeholders, other than the speculators, which are dime a dozen out there, they're few and far in between real stakeholders, but we're moving. The industry is growing. We are very nascent. It is growing, and we know, at least I know, that sometime in the future it will be very much adopted by the industries at large, especially governments.
Thanks, Lon. Julie or Arthur, maybe, who do you think are the most important stakeholders, and then in particular the users that are going to drive adoption of that technology? Who are you trying to target as users?
Well, you know, at IOTA we take a really broad definition of stakeholder, and it's a public permissionless project. So, you know, the stakeholders can be anybody. Anybody who has a need to connect in a cross-border way and be able to transfer data or payments in a secure way. And we try very hard not to define who the stakeholders are, because that's the beauty of permissionless innovation. We get contacted all the time by people who are building stuff on IOTA that we never would have thought of at the foundation. One of my favorite examples from last year was you know, a guy in, I think it was Uzbekistan, who came out with an app and released it on our Discord and, you know, promoted it a bit in the community for Tangle sheep, the IOTA Tangle. So basically, you can do a transaction in the app where you can decide, I would like to feed this gentleman's sheep. And you can just do it with a couple clicks of a button, and he hooked up some kind of a device to the feeding trough for his sheep, and there was a video camera as well, and you could push a button and see some sheep in Uzbekistan get fed. Immediately, like that. I don't know why you would want to feed sheep in Uzbekistan, but it's actually a pretty cool demonstration of the way that, you know, people can just build stuff on public permissionless technology that has these really cool cross-border implications. I can sit in Berlin and feed some sheep in Uzbekistan. I don't know why, but I can. And there are many other things that people do with it. I've been approached here at the conference by some community innovators who said that they are working on setting up peer-to-peer energy distribution, and they're working on peer-to-peer energy grids on IOTA and wanted to chat about that. And so we see the term stakeholder very broadly as, you know, people who are doing stuff that is interesting with these rails that we're building. And that's why, you know, we've been working really hard to get our developer documentation in order. It was a huge mess when IOTA started, and it was all over the place, and it was really difficult to find information about IOTA and how to build on it, how to contribute, etc. And we spent a huge amount of time and effort through our ecosystem director, putting together a website. You can go to docs.iota.org if you're a developer. And we're putting together blueprints as well from some of the exciting use cases that we see. So you can go to that website and download a blueprint for how to build a peer-to-peer energy grid on IOTA. There's a blueprint for how would you do track and trace if you wanted to build a track and trace use case for supply chain. How do you create a data marketplace? You know, you were talking about data and how the platforms have so much data and everything, and that's one of the beautiful things about this technology that we're building. You know, IOTA recently, earlier this year, announced a partnership with JLR, Jaguar Land Rover, in which they're putting IOTA wallets in their cars, and they are gathering data from the person driving around about road conditions, about where lanes change, about potholes, about all kinds of things, because our cars have so many sensors in them nowadays. They're gathering all that data, and what are you going to do with that data? Well, JLR would like to be able to analyze it because it helps them in their process of of moving towards self-driving cars, to understand what it's actually like for the car driving around on the road. They're gathering a lot of data from that. Well, but it's not really JLR's data, it's the personal data of the person who's driving around in the car, right? So they said, well, why don't we let our customers share in this data gathering process? It helps us to be able to build better products for them in the future, and we'll reward our customers with payments, with micropayments for transmitting this data to us. And then they can use them to pay in the future, their toll gates or their parking, which would also have, these kind of electronic wallets. So there are a lot of exciting ways in which these technologies can help us take back control over our data rather than just giving it all away for free, which is what we do now.
This sounds a lot like utility to me. This sounds a lot like utility to me, actual utility. But maybe Arthur,
Yeah, so I will agree that in public permissionless networks, really stakeholders is anyone who wants to be a stakeholder can be a stakeholder, and you don't know what people are going to build. And even though I do have some views on what applications might make sense or might not make sense, it's good to keep an open mind and to have a platform that allows for this application to happen. Doesn't mean it's a good idea to build them, but at the very least you don't want to close doors and if you don't have to. The second thing is specifically, I think. If you look in Tezos, one of the stakeholder group in Tezos that's particularly interesting is developers, because in other networks, it's traditional open source development where you will write some code, and if you disagree with the version of the code that everyone else is using, then you create your own version of the code, and that creates what is called a fork. And that's, the concept of fork has existed way before blockchain. It's a concept in open source development. I don't like your application, I'll make my own version. And that works very well if all you're building is an application. If I have some drawing application on my computer, you use your version, I use my version, no problem. It doesn't work at all for networks, because in a network, I want to be connected to you, you want to be connected to me, and if we have to be connected, we have to use the same version of the software. And so historically, the way this has worked in blockchains is people would write different versions and then they become incompatible, and these have been known as forks. The problem is that if you want to have changes, what process do you use in order for people to agree on that change? How do you know which version you're going to run? If someone comes in and say, hey, I've created a new version, you should all use it. Do you listen to them? Do you not listen to them? And the way this has been resolved traditionally is that, well, most people don't have a very strong view. Most people just want to follow the rest of the network. They want to be with the herd because that's where the safety is. And so, unfortunately, it creates a lot of weird coordination games which don't necessarily represent the intrinsic value of the change itself. And so what Tezos does is that it puts this governance procedure on the chain itself, so you let people voice what they prefer. You let them say, actually, I think this should be the version of the code, this should be, and anyone can do it. Anyone in the world can come in with a better version of Tezos, and instead of trying to launch the ENS cryptocurrencies, they can come in and say, I know how to do this better, and they can propose something, and they can be paid in doing so on the chain itself. So they can propose something, and they can issue coins to themselves in the process. And so it's an interesting set of stakeholders, because we do have core developers as stakeholders as a protocol. Of course, there are many other type of users and stakeholders, but I think that would be that's an interesting type of stakeholders which has been overlooked in the past.
Thank you. Thanks. A lot of challenges to grow permissionless innovation. I think we have the first question already from the community. I don't know if that comes up out there. Yes. Is a DAO inevitable to enable a permissionless network? And it's tying back to the first question we asked about governance. Who would like to address that?
I can take it. So I think DAOs and permissionless networks go together very well. So I think DAOs are great ideas. However, I don't think they're necessary. For example, Bitcoin is clearly permissionless and it doesn't have a DAO. So it's not inevitable, but I think they're great ideas, and I hope we see more of them. They got a bad rap because of the DAO, which was usually only one possible instantiation of a DAO, and they were doing something very specific. And it's a much more generic idea. It's the idea of basically doing some sort of governance and running some form of organizations using a blockchain, and I think there's many applications to that.
I love this question because is a DAO inevitable? I fully agree with Arthur that you don't need them to build public permissionless networks. But it is an exciting idea because it's a new way of letting people get together and make collective financial decisions, essentially. The DAO, as we all know, was a disaster in how it was executed from a technical perspective. But you learn from these things, and one of the things that was a very important lesson from that was, I threw some ether into the DAO because when I saw the announcement, I thought this is going to be fun. We're going to see what happens with this, and the DAO, before it exploded, or before it was hacked, it was really interesting to monitor the sort of online forum and the kinds of projects that were being proposed. And many of them were terrible ideas, terrible ideas, things that an angel or a VC would never, ever invest in. And the whole idea was, well, the wisdom of the crowd, jointly together is wiser than any one investor would be. So let's just, give these decisions to the DAO and let this consensus mechanism do its magic. It turns out the crowd is not all that wise in a lot of situations. And if you look at the social science research, you'll see that the wisdom of the crowd as a principle only holds under certain conditions. One of them is the diversity of the crowd. And you certainly did not have a diverse crowd when you have a bunch of people who are speculators in cryptocurrencies making financial decisions together within a bubble. So there were all kinds of lessons to be drawn from that, and there are a number of other DAOs out there that are still running with various different aims and greater and lesser degrees of success. But I think that this is an evolution that is still yet to take place because it's really difficult, actually, to set up the rules in a way that converges around consensus decision-making in a thoughtful way, in a way that actually makes sense and that does help the investors or those contributing, whatever it is, to the DAO to make good decisions. I think it will get really interesting when we see DAOs that are machine-owned and that are where the decision-making is being done by AI on the basis of a lot of data.
Ron, would you like to add to that?
I'll help you along with the time. Short line on it. DAO is an option. It is not inevitable. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Then I would say this concludes our panel today. Thank you so much, Julie, Arthur, Lon. Amazing. And good event to everybody. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you about all of you guys enlightening us on the challenges. I found it a very interesting discussion here. What one of my biggest takeaways is basically the acute shortage of education, along with the fact that we might look at STO driving be the main driver for mainstream. So again, we now have a coffee break. These might be some of the questions that you can ponder. We'll be back here. We start back at 11:20 instead of 11:15. So if you want to go for the next round, 11:20. Thank you so much and enjoy your coffee.